If you have ever waited by a phone, praying it would ring with good news instead of bad, you already understand the ache at the center of this story. Stay with it until the end, because what one exhausted, ordinary man did over 3 sleepless days will remind you what people are actually capable of when it matters most. And if this story reaches you the way it reached me while I was writing it, take a second to like this video and subscribe, because there are so many more stories like it still waiting to be told. Nathan Cole had a rule he never broke. Not once in the 4 years since his divorce had left him raising his daughter Lily on his own. If she needed him, he came, no matter what else was happening in his life. It was a small rule, almost embarrassingly simple, but it had shaped every decision he'd made since the day his ex-wife moved out of state, and Lily, then 6 years old, had looked up at him with an expression far too solemn for a child her age, and asked if he was going to leave too. He had promised her, right there in their kitchen, that he never would. He had spent every day since proving it. He worked as a park ranger for the county, patrolling nearly 40,000 acres of forest, ridge trail, and reservoir shoreline that made up Cedar Hollow State Park, a sprawling wilderness that drew hikers and campers from 3 counties over. It was work he loved with an uncomplicated devotion. The quiet of the woods at dawn, the particular satisfaction of knowing a piece of land so well he could navigate its ravines and deer trails with his eyes half closed. It also meant he understood, better than almost anyone in the county, exactly how easily that same beautiful wilderness could swallow a person whole. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered from a decade of trail work, with sun-weathered skin and the kind of quiet, watchful patience that made children trust him instantly, and adults relax around him without quite knowing why. Lily, who was 10 now, spent every other weekend with him in the small ranger cabin at the edge of the park, and those weekends were, without exaggeration, the best hours of his month. It was work that had taught him things most people never had reason to learn: how a person's fear changes the way they move through unfamiliar terrain, how children in particular tended not to walk in straight lines when frightened, but to drift, almost magnetically, toward whatever felt like shelter: a fallen log, a dense stand of brush, an overhang of rock. Anywhere a small body's instinct told it might be safe from a world that had suddenly become too large. He had pulled 2 lost hikers off the ridge trail in his first 2 years on the job, both adults, both embarrassed and grateful and entirely unharmed, and he had told himself, at the time, that this was the worst version of his job he would likely ever have to face. He would later understand how naive that assumption had been. Lily was 10 now, sharp-witted and stubborn in a way that reminded Nathan, more than he ever admitted aloud, of her mother, though she had inherited his patience and his quiet way of watching a room before speaking in it. She loved the ranger cabin's lack of reliable internet more than she would ever have loved a bigger house in town, because it meant her father's full, undivided attention for 2 days at a stretch, an arrangement that suited them both. Nathan kept a small corkboard in the cabin's kitchen, covered entirely in her drawings, updated every few months as her artistic ambitions outgrew stick figures, and he had promised her, with the same solemn seriousness he brought to every promise he made her, that no matter what else happened in his work, their weekends were sacred, untouchable, and would remain so for as long as she wanted them. It was the 2nd Friday of October, with the maples along the ridge trail just beginning to blaze red and gold, when the call came in over his radio that would change everything. A family named the Hayeses had been camping in the park's northern loop, a popular but genuinely rugged stretch of terrain that dropped steeply toward a series of limestone ravines. Their 6-year-old daughter, Emma, had wandered from the campsite sometime around 4 in the afternoon, while her mother, Diane, was occupied setting up their tent, and by the time anyone noticed she was gone, the light was already beginning to fail, and a light, cold rain had started to fall. Nathan was 12 miles away on a routine patrol when the call came through. and he turned his truck around before the dispatcher had even finished the sentence. He knew that section of the park intimately. The northern loop was notorious among rangers for its disorienting network of near-identical ravines. The kind of terrain that could turn a confident adult around in 20 minutes, let alone a frightened 6-year-old alone in the coming dark. By the time Nathan arrived at the campsite, the scene was already a controlled kind of chaos. 2 other rangers, a county sheriff's deputy and Diane Hayes, a woman in her late 30s whose face had the specific ashen stillness of a parent trying very hard not to fall apart in front of the people who needed her to stay coherent enough to help. Her husband, Robert, was pacing the tree line shouting Emma's name into a forest that offered nothing back but the rain and the wind moving through the pines. Diane grabbed Nathan's arm the moment she recognized his ranger uniform, and the words came out of her in a rush, disjointed and desperate. Emma had a pink jacket. Emma was afraid of the dark, but braver about it than most kids her age. Emma had wandered off before, once, at a shopping mall, and they'd found her 4 aisles over, completely unbothered, examining a display of stuffed animals as though nothing were wrong. And Diane kept saying that detail, over and over. Please, maybe she's just looking at something. Maybe she's fine. In the specific, desperate repetition of a person trying to will a memory into becoming a prophecy. Nathan had 2 daughters in his head in that moment, though only one of them was his. He thought of Lily, safe 40 miles away with her mother for the week, and he thought of this small girl he had never met, somewhere out in nearly 40,000 acres of darkening, rain-slicked wilderness, and something in his chest set itself with a kind of grim, immovable resolve. He told Diane, as calmly as he could manage, that they would find her daughter, and he meant it as a statement of fact rather than comfort, because he had already decided, somewhere below conscious thought, that he was not leaving those woods until it was true. The search that followed would later be described, in the county's official incident report, as one of the largest coordinated wilderness searches the department had conducted in over a decade. Search and rescue volunteers arrived from 3 neighboring counties. A canine unit was brought in before midnight. A helicopter with thermal imaging capability flew grid patterns over the ravines whenever the weather allowed, which was not often, because the rain that had started that afternoon settled into a slow, steady, miserable rhythm that would not fully break for 2 days. Nathan did not go home. He did not really sleep, not properly, not for longer stretches than the exhausted half-consciousness a person falls into sitting upright against a tree trunk for 20 minutes before some instinct jolts them back awake. He knew the terrain better than the visiting volunteers, better even than most of his fellow rangers, and he used that knowledge like a tool, methodically working the ravines in the pattern he judged a frightened, disoriented 6-year-old would most plausibly have taken, not the shortest path, which was what inexperienced searchers tended to assume, but the path of least resistance, the one that avoided the steepest inclines and the densest brush. The path a small, tired body would drift toward almost without choosing it. The first day produced nothing but a single confirmed sighting from a hiker 2 miles from the campsite, who thought, though could not be certain, that they had glimpsed a small figure in pink moving through the trees around dusk. It was enough to redirect the search's center of gravity eastward, toward a section of the park where the ravines grew deeper, and the tree cover grew thick enough to blot out most of the gray daylight, even at noon. It was also, Nathan knew without saying it aloud to Diane, the section of the park closest to the reservoir's steep, eroding southern bank, a piece of terrain that had claimed more than one experienced adult hiker's ankle over the years. The second day brought a break in the rain by early afternoon, and with it, the helicopter's thermal camera picked up a heat signature in a ravine nearly 3.5 miles from the campsite, tucked beneath what appeared to be a rock overhang. By the time ground teams reached the coordinates, scrambling down a slope slick with wet leaves and loose shale, the signature had moved, and the search team that reached the overhang found only a scrap of pink fabric snagged on a branch. Evidence that Emma had been there, and evidence, more painfully, that she had kept moving. Nathan carried that scrap of fabric in his jacket pocket for the rest of the search. He did not examine it, did not need to. It was enough to know it was real, that they were following an actual child through actual woods, rather than chasing a hope that might not exist at all. Diane, when she learned of the fabric, asked to see it, and Nathan hesitated before showing her, worried the sight of it might break something in her that the search itself had not yet managed to break. Instead, she held it for a long moment, her thumb moving over the torn edge, and then she handed it back to him and asked him, quietly, to keep it safe until Emma could have it back herself, as though the scrap of fabric were not evidence of danger, but a kind of promise, a physical thread connecting the search to the daughter. It was still, however painfully, following. Nathan tucked it back into his pocket and did not take it out again until the search was over. The search command post, by the second morning, had become its own small, exhausted village, folding tables covered in topographic maps marked with grease pencil, thermoses of coffee gone cold and forgotten, a row of muddy boots drying beside a propane heater, volunteers arriving in numbers that eventually outpaced the coordinator's ability to organize them efficiently. Nathan moved through all of it with a kind of narrowed, economical focus, sleeping in brief snatches, eating only when someone physically put food in his hands and told him to, his entire attention bent toward the map and the terrain and the steadily narrowing set of possibilities for where a 6-year-old could still be, and still be safe after this many hours exposed to the cold. By the evening of the second day, 36 hours into a search that had begun to draw regional news coverage, the temperature dropped sharply, and a hard frost was forecast for overnight. Nathan understood with the specific clinical dread of someone who had spent a decade learning exactly what wilderness could do to an unprepared body. What a night at those temperatures would mean for a 6-year-old already wet, already exhausted, already alone for over 40 hours. He did not say this aloud to Diane, who was by then barely functioning, wrapped in a blanket at the command tent, her husband holding her upright through sheer proximity. He said it, instead, to himself, in the quiet, focused voice a person uses to steady their own hands, and he asked the search coordinator for permission to take a smaller, faster team back into the eastern ravines overnight. Working by headlamp, moving through terrain the larger search groups had judged too dangerous to cover in the dark. It was granted, reluctantly, with a safety officer's insistence on radio check-ins every 20 minutes. Nathan took 2 volunteers he trusted and a search dog named Bear, and they went back into the ravines as the temperature continued to fall. The frost beginning to silver the underbrush, their headlamp beams cutting narrow cones of light through a darkness that pressed in from every direction. They found her a little after 2 in the morning, in a shallow limestone alcove nearly 4 miles from the campsite, tucked into a space barely large enough for her small body. Her pink jacket soaked through, her lips faintly blue, curled into the tightest possible ball against the cold. Bear found her first, a sudden change in the dog's posture and bearing that made the handler's breath catch. And then Nathan was there, dropping to his knees on the frozen ground. And Emma Hayes opened her eyes to a stranger's face lit by headlamp, and for one terrible, suspended second, Nathan was afraid, genuinely afraid in a way he would later struggle to describe, that they had arrived too late. She was alive, cold, dehydrated, disoriented, but alive. And when Nathan pulled off his own jacket and wrapped it around her small, shaking frame, she looked up at him with the dazed, uncomprehending gaze of a child, surfacing from something too large for her to fully process. And she said, in a small, cracked voice that Nathan would remember for the rest of his life, "I want my mom," he told her as he lifted her carefully against his chest. Careful of the early signs of hypothermia, the responding paramedic would confirm within the hour that he was going to take her to her mom right now, that her mom had never once stopped looking for her. not for a single minute across 2 days and 2 nights, and that everything from this moment forward was going to be all right. The 4-mile carry back through the ravines, in the dark, over uneven frozen ground, with a radio call already alerting the command tent that Emma Hayes had been found alive, was, Nathan would later say, the longest and shortest walk of his life. Long because every step felt suspended in an unbearable, protective urgency, and short because it was over. Impossibly, in what felt like no time at all, the trees thinning ahead of him, floodlights and headlights and a crowd of exhausted, weeping searchers coming into view, Diane Hayes would later describe, to the same local reporter who eventually wrote up the full story, the sound she made when she saw Nathan emerge from the tree line carrying her daughter. A sound she said she did not recognize as her own voice, something closer, she said, to the sound an animal makes, pure and wordless and entirely involuntary. She crossed the distance between them at a dead run, and Nathan knelt to place Emma directly into her mother's arms, and the two of them collapsed together onto the wet ground, Robert reaching them a half-second later. The three of them folded into each other in a knot that no one, not the paramedics waiting to check Emma's vitals, not the exhausted search volunteers, not Nathan himself, had the heart to interrupt for nearly a full minute. Emma spent 2 nights in the hospital being treated for mild hypothermia and dehydration, and made what doctors called, with evident relief, a remarkably full and rapid recovery for a child who had spent nearly 58 hours alone in the wilderness. Those 2 nights were, for Nathan, the strange, deflating aftermath that rarely gets told alongside stories like this one. The hours after the danger has passed, but before a person's body and mind have caught up to the fact that they can finally stop. He drove back to his cabin sometime near dawn on the 3rd day, showered for the first time in 3 days, and then sat for nearly an hour at his kitchen table without moving, staring at nothing in particular. The adrenaline that had carried him through 58 hours draining out of him all at once and leaving behind something closer to a controlled kind of collapse. He did not cry, not exactly, but he sat with his head in his hands for a long time. And when he finally called Lily's mother to ask if he could talk to Lily for a few minutes, his voice, by his own later admission, did not sound entirely like his own. The story of her rescue spread quickly through the county, and then well beyond it, driven largely by a piece of footage a volunteer had captured on their phone. Nathan, emerging from the dark tree line with Emma wrapped in his jacket, her mother's collapse into his arms, a moment of pure, unguarded human relief that resonated with strangers who had never set foot in Cedar Hollow State Park and never would. What the footage could not fully capture, though, was the quieter story underneath it, the particular, specific expertise that had made the difference between finding Emma alive and not finding her in time. In the weeks that followed, as the county held a small ceremony honoring the search and rescue effort, the Sheriff's Department's official commendation noted that Nathan's decision to request the overnight search authorization, against the initial caution of command staff, was very likely the deciding factor in Emma's survival, given the forecasted overnight frost and her already compromised condition by the 2nd evening. Nathan, for his part, deflected almost all of it. He credited the dog, Bear, and the 2 volunteers who had gone into the dark ravines with him. He credited the hiker who had reported the possible sighting on the 1st day, redirecting the search's focus eastward. He credited, more than anything, Diane's insistence, repeated to every searcher who would listen across 2 exhausting days, on every small detail of her daughter's habits and fears, details that had shaped Nathan's read of which direction a frightened 6-year-old would most likely drift. The ceremony itself was small and a little awkward, held in the county courthouse's modest community room, folding chairs arranged in uneven rows. A sheet cake from the grocery store 2 towns over sitting on a table beside a hand-lettered banner one of the search volunteers had made. Nathan stood at the front in a uniform he had pressed the night before for the first time in years, listening to the sheriff read a commendation that used words like extraordinary and exemplary, words that sat uncomfortably on him, words that felt like they belonged to someone else's version of those 58 hours rather than the exhausted, single-minded blur he actually remembered living through. Diane spoke too, briefly, her voice steady until the very last sentence, when it broke completely, and she simply said that she did not have words adequate to the size of what Nathan had given her family back, and that she hoped he understood anyway. Bear, the search dog, received his own small round of applause and a dog biscuit the size of a dinner plate, presented with great ceremony by Emma herself, who had insisted on being the one to hand it over, and who spent much of the reception afterward sitting on the floor beside him, narrating to anyone who would listen a detailed account of exactly how brave and clever he was, an account that grew slightly more elaborate with each retelling. But those who worked alongside him during those 58 hours understood, even if Nathan himself resisted saying it plainly, that his decision to keep moving through a second sleepless night, into terrain that more cautious judgment might have postponed until daylight, was not luck, and it was not simply professional competence. It was something closer to the same instinct that had kept him showing up every other weekend for 4 years, for a daughter who was not lost, but who needed him all the same. He had simply extended that same unbending devotion for one impossible night toward a child who was not his own, because somewhere in those dark ravines, he had stopped thinking of Emma Hayes as someone else's daughter and started thinking of her, without permission or hesitation, as exactly the kind of child worth staying awake 3 nights for. Diane Hayes and her family stayed in touch with Nathan long after the search ended. First, through a handwritten thank you letter, Emma insisted on illustrating herself with a crayon drawing of a man in a green ranger jacket standing next to a large, enthusiastic-looking dog, and later through an invitation to Emma's 7th birthday party the following spring, where Nathan arrived, a little awkwardly, uncertain of his place at a child's birthday celebration, and left several hours later, having been informally adopted by the entire extended Hayes family, as something between a family friend and, as Diane put it with a laugh that still carried an edge of the fear she'd felt that October, an honorary guardian angel who happened to also enjoy cake. Lily, when Nathan finally told her the full story on their next weekend together, listened with the particular fierce attention 10-year-olds reserve for stories that involve both danger and a happy ending. And at the end of it, she asked him, with the blunt clarity children are so good at, whether he had been scared. He told her the truth, which was that he had been more scared than almost any other moment of his life, and that he had kept going anyway because that was what you did for someone you had decided mattered, whether you had known them for 10 years or 10 minutes. Lily considered this for a long moment, and then she told him, with total confidence, that this was exactly the kind of dad he was, and that Emma Hayes was lucky it had been him out there in those woods. She asked him one more question, too, quieter than the rest, sitting cross-legged on the cabin floor with her knees pulled to her chest, whether he would have gone looking for her if it had been her lost out there instead of Emma. Nathan did not answer right away, not because he was unsure, but because the question deserved more than a reflexive yes. He told her, eventually, that he would have gone looking for her before anyone even finished explaining what had happened, that there was no version of the world in which he would have waited for permission or daylight or anything else, and that the reason he had gone into those ravines for Emma at all was, in some fundamental way, because of the promise he had already made to Lily years earlier, a promise that had simply grown large enough, somewhere along the way, to include other people's daughters too. Nathan still works the northern loop of Cedar Hollow State Park, and he still keeps that scrap of pink fabric, faded now, folded carefully in a small box in his cabin. Not as a trophy, he says when people ask, but as a reminder of exactly how thin the margin can be between a story that ends in relief and one that does not, and of how much difference it can make when even one person refuses to let that margin close without a fight. He has, in the years since, become something of an informal mentor to newer rangers joining the county's search and rescue rotation, less through any formal program than through a habit of showing up at training exercises on his own time, walking newcomers through the specific, hard-won instincts that had guided him through those ravines, how to read the small signs of a frightened child's likely path, how to weigh the risk of night search against the risk of another cold hour lost to caution, how to keep a search coordinator's confidence even when your own certainty is thinner than you'd like to admit. He does not think of this as teaching a skill so much as passing along a debt, repaying, in his own quiet way, whatever it was that had put him 12 miles from that campsite on the one afternoon it mattered most. Emma Hayes is 8 years old now, and every October, on the anniversary of the day she was found, the Hayes family drives out to Cedar Hollow and brings Nathan a homemade card, a tradition Emma started herself and has refused to let lapse. Each year's drawing a little more detailed than the last, though the central image never changes. A man in a green jacket, a dog beside him, and a small girl in pink. Finally, impossibly, found. The visits have become, in their own understated way, a fixture of Nathan's year, one he looks forward to with an anticipation he does not entirely know how to explain to people who ask about it. Diane usually brings coffee and a story about whatever Emma has most recently become obsessed with. A science fair project, a new favorite book, an ongoing campaign to adopt a second dog to keep Bear company on his visits, and Robert usually ends up helping Nathan with some small repair project around the cabin, the two of them falling into an easy, uncomplicated companionship built entirely on the foundation of that one impossible night. Lily has met Emma twice now, and the two girls, 4 years apart in age, have developed the particular fierce loyalty of children who understand, even if only partially, that their father's worlds intersected at exactly one crucial, unrepeatable moment, and that this intersection is worth honoring. Nathan does not tell the story often, and when he does, he tells it plainly, without embellishment, in the same measured voice he uses for everything else. But there is one detail he includes every single time, without fail, the detail that seems to matter to him more than any commendation or news segment or ceremony ever did. The exact sound of Emma's voice, small and cracked in the dark, saying she wanted her mother, and the specific, uncomplicated certainty he felt in that moment that he was going to make sure she got there, whatever it cost him to see it through. If this story moved you the way it moved me, think for a moment about the people in your own life who would go looking for you in the dark without a second thought, and let them know what that means to you. And if you want more stories like this one, about the quiet, extraordinary things ordinary people do for each other, make sure you're subscribed, because there are so many more of them still waiting to be told.